So we're here in Bundagen on the northern New South Wales coast at the home of Peter and Lorna Cook on the 11th of October 2007, where we are going to attempt to draw out from Peter some of his memories and early influences that led to him being one of the giants in the Australian field of attachment. And I caught that snicker there, Lorna. No, he really is a giant, and the Bulby of Australia, maybe.
Good one. Whipping it up, isn't he?
So, and you met Bulby, right?
Yes, I did.
So, but let's start with how you got into this whole area of attachment, and what you were a young medico out of your training, and what.
Well, my father was an Anglican clergyman, and my mother was a doctor. And they married on the basis that he would go to Japan as a teacher, because they wanted a Christian to go to Hiroshima. And so he was the teacher at the Kodagako, and I was born in Japan and reared with a lovely Japanese nurse. And at 6 months, or about a year, I had a separation experience, about a fortnight, when they went to Taiwan, of which I know nothing. And my mother was a normal, healthy person, but she didn't know anything about that being a bad business. And then when I was 2.5, they were afraid I'd fall into the moat. They'd moved to Hikone, which is not Hakone, but Hikone, which is, there's a shogun castle, you can see it on the internet, with a moat. They were afraid I would fall into the moat. So they decided that I and my sister and my mother had better go back to England, and Dad would stay on in Japan for 6 months to complete his contract. So we got on a ship, and I think I then had a separation experience which was important, in that I lost my Japanese language, I lost my father, I lost my nurse, I lost my home, I lost all that in one my friends, all in one clean break. And there was no continuity between that and later. And after 6 weeks on the ship, I met up with my grandmother and family and lived there. And my first memory is when I was 2 3/4, which was about 6 weeks, 3 months after I'd left Japan. I didn't see my father again for 6 months. I think that was a crucial experience, which I was not really aware of, the importance of it, till much later. But anyhow, my father became interested. There was a man called Bevan Brown, who was a New Zealand doctor who went to England in the 1920s, and he worked with a group at the Tavistock Clinic. I've described that in my paper. But they were a sort of independent, eclectic group interested in dynamic psychotherapy, but they did not agree altogether with the psychoanalytic orthodox line. And Bowlby himself came out of that culture, that pre-war Tavistock culture. So when the war broke out, they were all dispersed, and Bevan Brown came back to New Zealand in about 1940. He started trying to tell people what he'd learnt in England over those years. The doctors were all too busy to take an interest. But he formed a mental health group and started giving lectures, and my parents were interested. Mother, the wartime was on, 1940, and Mother was in general practice, and my father was in a parish. But they started listening to Bevan Brown. They got interested, as did a number of other people.
Now, you were how old at this point?
I was in my teens.
Mm-hmm.
I went to New Zealand when I was 12 at the outbreak of war. And then they moved house and bought in 1945 a house that they set up a clinic, and they called it the Cranmer House Clinic, quite near the centre of Christchurch. It was a big house, and they established a clinic for psychotherapy. My father had been printed the parish magazine, much like the Gutenberg people, and he did that side of it. And my mother and Bevan Brown and other people that he trained. So Bevan Brown set about training lay people, and he was very interested in early nurture, the early years, and they organised classes for medical students. By this time I was a medical student in Dunedin, and I thought there's a lot of bullshit about the early years. anyhow, I had a sort of conversion experience, I suppose, when at a conference for medical students I heard a presentation, which is in this book, The Sources of Love and Fear, about an extraordinary sort of cure in about 3 sessions. And I thought, that's very interesting. If it can happen once, there's something to this. And I've always tended to be a bit like that. If something interests me, that I think there's something special here, I go for it. Anyhow, then I went on and finished my medical course and was doing the 3 monthly runs. And when I was doing paediatrics in 1951, I looked at the medical journal, British Medical Journal, and it said Maternal Care and Mental Health, published by the World Health Organization by John Bowlby. So I promptly wrote off for it. I probably had the first copy in New Zealand. I thought, this is, you know, got the stamp of authority. This isn't you know, eccentric rubbish. So I got it, and I thought, and then I saw that there was a shortage of child psychiatrists. So I went to England in 1951 with my father, and I grew up in an atmosphere of making the world a better place, you see. And this is part of growing up in a Christian background, that you want to make the world a better place. And so I went to England and I went to see Winnicott. I had an interview with him and he said, get a spot on the Piccadilly line. I went to a most dreadful mental hospital, Friern Hospital, but it was on the Piccadilly line. And then after 5 months there, I got a job at the Maudsley, and they said, well, don't go into analysis because it'll mess up your training. So I didn't. And, but I exposed to quite a lot of analysts. We saw all sorts of people there, psychoanalysts of various ilks. And I did the children, and I did my diploma of psychological medicine and my DP, diploma of child health. And I went to J. Hadfield for a year for analysis, and he was a sort of father figure of that pre-war Tavistock movement. And so you can read about him again in this essay I've written about these people. And then I went back to New Zealand and I started in private practice. I was the only child psychiatrist, trained child psychiatrist in New Zealand.
Wow.
And after I married Lorna, we married we got to know each other under idyllic circumstances, really. And I said, this is what I want to do in life. I want to try and see what I can do for child mental health. And she had been learning the same ideas in part of her diploma of education. Ashley Montague's book, The Direction of Human Development, was one book that I think we both read.
No, I haven't.
You haven't?
No.
Anyway, we both picked up the same ideas from different sources, so it was good. So we talked about how would it be if we got married, and she thought that was a great idea.
Well, how did you meet, if I can interrupt for a second?
Oh, well, we met in Paris, and he was driving a lovely blue convertible car.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was driving this blue Ford convertible.
Well, we went on holiday through Europe.
Tax-free, and I had
In
to
this
get it
car.
out of England. And yeah, that's how we met's an extraordinary story.
Well, he just picked you up in his blue convertible?
No. His sister was in Paris as an au pair, and I was working in a school teaching English. And I knew his sister, and then it was through.
If Anthony Eden's
her brother was coming, and I should meet him.
It was a whole heap of things. If Anthony Eden's called,
don't worry about that now.
Hadn't got blocked in the. We
Peter,
wouldn't
there
have
isn't time.
Anyhow, we met and we got married in September, and I went to live in Northern Ireland, and there was a new mental retardation service, and I learnt the principle that you don't start with the hard ones, you start with the easy ones. Then I went back to New Zealand in February 1957, and I was confronted with I went to see these institutions, and they were terrible. And I thought, this is awful. So I gave a paper to the psychiatrist. This was my first paper.
You should have said how good the Northern Ireland service was.
The Northern Ireland service was brand new and good, and well rehabilitated people, kept them in the community. In New Zealand, they had official policy to put everybody in a mental deficiency institution. From the age
the
of
Northern
5
Ireland of New Zealand you're talking about?
No, Northern Ireland, Belfast.
Ireland, okay,
Ireland.
I thought you were saying Ireland.
Where
Northern
I grew up.
Ireland, Northern
So we
Ireland.
came back to Belfast with me.
Oh, okay, I didn't
After,
know.
we were married in Belfast, and then he worked there in the special care service for 6 months before
Oh.
we went to New Zealand. And, yeah.
So
I didn't even know you were Irish.
There you go.
This was the first reform I did, you see. So I gave this paper to the psychiatrists and some of the others, and together as a group we poured out a report on the care of the mentally retarded, which was in diametrical opposition to what the government had proposed, that every child who was moderately retarded, every Mongol, will live in an institution from the age of 5 for the rest of their lives. That was official government policy. I thought this was awful. Anyhow, and that was everything I wrote, and all the articles I've written have been designed to be able to be understood. That article was reprinted in the Otago Daily Times in full as an op-ed. And so I thought, well, New Zealand's a small country, a few people can rock the boat, my mother said. You know, a few people can change things. And then the next one was I got a child brought to me by his auntie, and his mother had gone into maternity hospital to have a baby. And the rules at that time were that you weren't allowed to bring children under 12 to visit. And I thought,
and you stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks.
You stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks for a rest. Now I could see this child getting disturbed. He was very disturbed by the separation experience. And I'd seen the film by Robertson, A 2-Year-Old Goes to Hospital. Mm-hmm. And after a while I got another one, and I got another one, and I got this mother to write me a letter, and it was brilliant. And I had these 3, and I wrote them up in a paper called A 2-Year-Old's Mother Goes to Maternity Hospital. And I suggested that a whole lot of the upset normally attributed to sibling rivalry is really caused by a preceding separation, which makes the child really upset when mum comes home with a baby in her arms. And that was summarised in the Medical Journal in Australia. It was in the BMJ, in the British Medical Journal, editorially. Why not child visitors? And it was quoted in the psychoanalytic study of the child. So I thought, you know, you can change things. And that whole policy dissolved because it was obviously not based on anything but prejudice. And then Bevan Brown's group formed, I got interested in natural childbirth. When I was in the maternity hospital, in 5th year we did 25 deliveries. And as soon as I got to the maternity hospital, I had the most blood-curdling screams. And the first woman I saw in childbirth said, "Oh, doctor, don't let me ever have another baby." And I was wandering in the bookshop and I saw The Birth of a Child, and it was by Grantley Dick Reed. And I thought, it doesn't have to be like this. So when I was in England, I went to see Grantley Dick Reed, and I had quite a long chat with him, and he gave me recordings of his natural childbirths. But I began to see that the way things were could be changed. And so then the parents' centres were formed, the New Zealand Federation of Parents' Centres were formed, and they were preparing mothers for childbirth. But I thought, well, here's an opportunity to prepare them for parenthood. So I thought, I'll write down what should parents be told that would help them be good parents. What do they need to know? What's the basics? And I looked up the literature and found there was nothing, virtually nothing, except milestones. And I thought, milestones are no use except to tell you whether the kid's backward. So I wrote a paper called Antenatal Education for Childbirth as an aspect of preventive psychiatry, and I presented it in London in the World Federation for Mental Health conference in 1964, which was our first return home. And a Texan said to me, "Come to Texas and try it out." And I had several invitations on the way home to go to America, but I thought, well, by that stage I'd accepted the job in Sydney. But we stayed on the way in a Fijian village, and I was interested in other cultures because this chap Maloney from Okinawa had said that, you know, there are cultures where things are different. Whereas New Zealand at that time had an extremely punitive, rigid type of child rearing, you see.
Truby King stuff?
Truby King was supreme, and I've written about that in that thing. Anyway, I was working in the Children's Hospital in Sydney as a staff psychiatrist, and one day it dawned on me as I listened to patients, it wasn't quite as strident in Australia, but I thought the way my wife and I are rearing our children almost forms a logical contrast with the way most of these parents rear theirs. I sort of wrote it down on the back of an envelope, you know, the two sides of it. And I talked to a local Catholic priest about this, who was interested in non-violent power. And he said, oh, it's the old doctrine of original sin. He said, it goes right back to Augustine. He explained. So I began to look it all up. And that, but before then, before I left New Zealand, one of the people who's, they had this conference and they formed the New Zealand Association of Psychotherapists in 1947 in New Zealand. And my parents were involved in convening that. And I published an article about that with a photograph that I set up and then got into. And it has my entire nuclear family in it, which is rather fun. So I published a photograph of my nuclear family in a peer-reviewed journal. But that traces the early history of the New Zealand Association of Psychotherapists. I don't get onto that.
No, I do.
But that was quite important.
Well, I want to back up for a second because you were raising 4 children?
You can sit there if you like. 3.
3.
At this stage, yeah.
At this
and then we
stage,
had one in Sydney. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about you being the mom. How did you raise them and how were they born?
Well, the girls were all born at home in Christchurch.
And that was the norm at that point?
Oh, no, not at all, no.
So you had
but there was a nice English-trained midwife who was used to home births. She lived quite conveniently and was all very...
She was nearer than the hospital.
Yeah, so that all went very well. But when we came to Sydney, it wasn't done at all. We had Peter in Manly Hospital. That was all right. What else would you like to know?
Well, like were they breastfed? And
oh yes, yes. Well, actually, the second one wasn't breastfed for that long, only 3 months. Jenny was fed for about a year, I suppose, and Helen about the same.
Was co-sleeping a known thing at that point, or?
We had them in the cot beside us, didn't we?
Yes, I think so.
We had them in the cot beside us.
We didn't have a big bed, but yes, they were never far away.
And how far apart are they in years?
Well, 2 years between Jenny, the first one, and Margaret, and then Margaret was such a lovely baby, we thought we should have another one soon. And so Helen was only 15 months after that. And then Peter was 8 years later, young Peter, in Sydney. We thought we should have an Australian.
Right, so.
Well, another key experience for me was that one of the men in that photograph who was interested in Ben Brown's work was Dr. Ron Every, who was a sort of genius. He was an eccentric, and he got interested in the non-carious loss of tooth substance, and he identified 8 causes. And he came to the conclusion that the teeth were sharpened in sleep, and that what had previously been called bruxism was in fact a sharpening action, and he showed that it happened in other animals and mammals. It's a multiphyletic phenomenon. Now, I spent a day with him once, and this changed my life really, because he expounded to me the detailed anatomy of teeth. He was hired by one of the Smithsonian Institute, I think, to take photographs of skulls for 6 months. He was brilliant with an Exacta camera, and he showed me that anatomy and function evolved in parallel, and that this was true in humans even though they didn't know it. In other words, behaviour could be genetically programmed from birth. Now that was an important thing. And when I came to look at I thought, well, I'll look at our own babies like this and see if I can see things that, and I won't try and train them or make them behave, I'll see what unfolds. And as I said, one day it dawned on me that there was a logical contrast between the way we were rearing our children and the way most of the patients I saw were rearing theirs. And that's how I got onto the theory of it. And I wrote that up in 1973, that was published, and I published that in a conference. Then I went around the world on my sabbatical leave, discussing this paper with people, and anybody who was interested in this kind of evolutionary basis of human behaviour, I went to see. in Cambridge and London and Harvard and Hawaii and San Francisco, wherever, and Chicago. So I knew quite a lot about what was going on at that stage, and then I came back to Sydney, and they weren't terribly interested because I wasn't following the orthodox psychoanalytic path. I'd had about nearly 4 years of psychoanalysis when I was in Sydney at the Children's Hospital. So I was staff specialist there and then director of the Department of Psychiatry for about 9 years. But my interest in this was developing, and I was observing the... we initiated the reform of the welfare of children in hospital, which is a story in itself, how I did that, but I don't suppose you've got time to hear that. But that was fascinating, because I'd seen what was going on in England in the Platt Report and the reform of children in hospital initiated by Robertson's film, A 2-Year-Old Goes to Hospital. And I'd experienced what this meant when my own little sister went to hospital, and we went all the way to Nottingham to see her, and we didn't even say hello because we didn't want to upset her. And I said to one of my friends one day, one of my colleagues, the psychiatrist, I said, I think more harm is being done in this hospital by failure to apply what knowledge we have than can be undone by all the child psychiatrists in Australia if they did nothing else. And he said, I think you're right. And so that is an interesting story, and we wrote the first position statement. I won't go into all the details. We wrote the first position statement. That statement came out into the open on the public record, which is a story in itself. And it led to the formation of the Association for the Welfare of Children in Hospital. I gave it an address.
That was in Sydney?
In Sydney. I gave an address. 3 of us met, and one of them from the health department said, we will have a conference, and it will be held in the AMA building, the Australian Medical Association building, and I will organise it. And we convened people, and we each gave our story, and I said, in Australia we need an association for the welfare of children in hospital like the one in England. England had one, we didn't. And they said, who will form it? And they all looked around, because right at the end they were going to close the meeting, and I said, what about this? A lady put up her hand and looked around and said, if nobody else will, I will try. And about 9 people met, and we all sat around in a circle, and we said, tell this story of why you're here. One of them had been in the Holocaust and escaped from a Nazi, she'd survived a concentration camp. And these people told their story, bring tears to your eyes as to why they were there. And we, from that, built up this association. They got a big grant from the government, and eventually they were invited to produce a report on the care of children in hospital. And they did, and that was published as a special supplement in the Medical Journal of Australia. So it went throughout the country, and it was adopted by the New South Wales Department of Health as policy for children's care in hospital. And then it was adopted throughout Australia. So that showed us how, just a few people, again, with the right idea at the right time could reform something. Well, the next thing we did was Gorton was Member of Parliament, was the Prime Minister, and the feminists were just starting with their, daycare business. And we wrote another one called The Welfare of Children Whose Mothers Are in Full-Time Employment. And that was published. We published that too in the Medical Journal. And that I was asked to write a position statement for the college for the second one. I'd written the first one with Professor Barry Nurcombe. And I said, somebody else can do it. Anyhow, at the same time, the Women's Electoral Lobby was formed. And that was killed. In other words, there was a warning. The psychiatrists at that time were united, but more and more women came into it, and feminist ideology gradually took over. And we've now got a situation where if you look in the National Geographic for last month, Australia and the United States are the 2 worst countries on a world map for maternity leave. Do you want to stop?
Oh, no.
I mean, and that is an abysmal situation. Anyhow, I wrote up my paper on this thesis in 1978, and I submitted to the medical journal, and one anthropologist said, no, it shouldn't be published. And I said, well, I know another one who says it should. So they referred it to her, and she said, it's a very important paper. I'm going to quote it myself in the next thing. So that was the Childbearing Culture and Mental Health, exploring an ethological evolutionary perspective in preventive and child psychiatry. And that was a landmark paper in a way. It was a special supplement there, and Jan Hunt has now put it on a website. Anybody can read it. But the childcare business rolled on remorselessly. And I tried to do a research project to test my hypothesis that mothers who were distrusters, in basic distrust as I called it, if they were, you could ascertain them at birth. And Lorna and others did interviews with them in the maternity hospital. We devised a questionnaire, which was, and we came out with two papers, one which recorded the differences between these mothers and childcare nurses. They weren't called childcare nurses, they were mother care nurses. And they had quite different views about babies and how they should be reared. And then we followed them up for 3 years on a symptom scale. I submitted those to the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, and they had a few quibbles, and I didn't like some things, and I got discouraged. The team broke up, and I wasn't very well. I had undiagnosed celiac disease, so we dropped it, but it was published. And so at that point then I stopped much writing because I wasn't very well, and I had this celiac which nobody seemed able to diagnose at that stage. And then in 1994 I kept hearing about childcare, and I rang this woman who was always being quoted on the radio, and I said, where's your evidence for all this? She said, oh, we've got the references, we've done the literature. I said, well, could you let me have them? She said, no, you'll only use it to refute us. And I thought, well, that's not very good. And then this woman, Gay Appletree, wrote a book called 40 Years of Research in Childcare. What was it? Published by the Australian Institute of Family Studies, which is committed, really, in Melbourne to early childcare and women working and fairness thing. So then I came across an article in the Reader's Digest by, what's his name? Zinsmeister.
Yeah, Zinsmeister.
Carl Zinsmeister. And I rang him up and I said, I think your article is very important. He said, care is not so hard to find, but love, that is more difficult. I thought, oh, interesting. So I got his full article and I rang him up and I said, do you know anybody who's I could talk to about this? Because as the book's come out, I'd like to get a review. He said, well, Jay Belsky's good value, you could try him. So I thought, nothing venture, nothing win. I was sitting in here and I dialed the numbers and said, we've got Penn State University, and I said, could I speak to Professor Jay Belsky? And they said, yes, just a moment, I'll put you through, Belsky. And I said, introduced myself, and I said, this is the situation, this book's come out, and I wondered if I could talk to you about it. And he said, it's your nickel. And so he talked to me for 20 minutes. And I thought, wow. And at the end of it, I said, could you send me any reprints that you've written about this? And he sent me 4. And I read them and I thought, gosh, this is dynamite. Here are these people ploughing on with this, and here's this stuff. So then I started trying to put it down in a document. And I got the first draft of it, and we went to England, when was it?
93.
93, was it?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't.
95.
95. And I went to stay with Jay. We had a couple of nights with him, so I got to know him, and I talked to Burton L. White, whom I'd known of for years, and I saw various people. I met Jim Prescott at the National, I met him in 73. I met Jim Prescott in 73 on that round when I went.
We met him again in 95.
When he was at the National Institute of Child Health. Anyhow, and I got in touch with all sorts of people. So I did the rounds of anybody who was interesting then in 1995, the Watched people in Cambridge. And that was very interesting, and I'd sent a copy to I went to see Penelope Leach, we went to see her, and I asked her for permission to print some of her stuff. And I said, I need an editor really, and she said, pointed to Lorna and said, you've got one here. And she was right, she really was. I mean, she was very shrewd. Anyhow, I started writing this stuff down, and I thought, oh God. And I sent, somehow a copy got its way to Elliot Barker, and one day I got a letter from Elliot, and he said, Dear Dr. Peter Cook, Laura, my wife and I have read your article in bed at last, and we were excited. Don't give up, do write a book. So I thought, well, and I was sitting in this place here, and had I got the computer then? I had trying a word processor. I had my first simple, no internet, I didn't have any internet. And I started writing this stuff down. And it gradually turned into this book, you see. And Elliot said, why don't you get the internet? Snail mail's no good. And I said, once I get the internet, I'll never get my book done. So finally I did the book. And it took a bit of work, but I did it right here. And you can see how cut off you are from things. But on the other hand, you don't have the interruptions. I mean, there's no mains power here. There's a phone line, and that's it. And so I put that stuff together, and I took the various papers that Jay Belsky had given me and other things, and I wove it into that book on childcare using the evolutionary perspective, you see. And then when it was done, I asked him if he'd write the introduction, and he said yes. Well, that put it on the map when Jay wrote the introduction. So then I started...
Keep talking. Since you mentioned the environment here, I want to pan around while you talk.
Yeah. It's lovely.
So keep going with the story.
We have wallabies out there outside, and there were two pythons. It was quite interesting. There were two pythons wrapped up, coiled. We saw them making love, and then they were all coiled up together. And a smaller one came along just down the hill there and snuggled up to them. And it snuggled its way in, gradually, very slowly, wove its way into these two pythons that were sitting beside, between a set of batteries and some wire netting, so you could see them. And I thought, well, even these pythons know more about attachment than the people that are running childcare policy in Australia. And we see wallabies out here with a mother wallaby, and they're in the pouch, and you see a little baby coming out of the pouch and nibbling the grass and hopping out and going back in again. And you can watch it all just under the tree there. They come in the morning and eat the flowers. It's a beautiful place. So that was how it took off, and then I started doing these other papers that I've written since. But with the computer and the internet, it opens up a whole new world. And my book was, I had a member of Parliament who became Minister of Health, and so I wrote it up into the Medical Journal of Australia, rethinking the early childcare agenda. And that, the editor finally despaired of my persistence and sent me back a copy with blue pencils through it. And when I typed that out, it was right. So it got printed, and my Member of Parliament sent a copy to every Member of Parliament in Canberra. And he invited me to go, and I went there and gave a presentation to about 30 Members of Parliament. And about 15 of them bought a copy of my book for $10. 15, I think I sold them $10. And I felt we were getting somewhere. And then I realised that this was a kind of remorseless juggernaut that was grinding on and sweeping people in for financial reasons regardless. And I said in my book that I hoped that the parties would not compete for how hairy-chested they could be in providing childcare. But this is exactly what they have done and are doing. And so I bought some shares in ABC Learning Centres because I thought it's an evil organisation. And they're planning more. Anyhow, their shares have gone up 156%, their profits in the past year. But they had the hide of the private childcare people to say they could not afford to reduce the staffing from 1 to 5 to 1 to 4 for babies, you know. which is pretty poor really, and we have a report to say that this is not high quality care. So that's what sort of galvanised me and kept me going, because on the one hand I've known how things can be, and on the other hand I've seen what is happening. That's how I came to write my present essay, because I wanted to kind of do an update on my book in a way and bring it all together in simple terms that people like my grandchildren could understand if they, I don't think there's anything in it that Sienna couldn't understand if she wanted to. So that's how I got to here.
We've got less than a minute left on this tape, but could you mention a few of the other names? You mentioned Bowlby and
yeah, I went to see Bowlby in 1970, what was it, 75 was it, or 95? Anyhow, I gave him a copy of my paper, and he gave me a copy of his essay, his lecture, his first Freudian lecture on psychoanalysis as a science. And he wrote to Peter Cook in appreciation of your work, which I was quite glad for. I had about an hour talking to him on that. I wished I'd met him earlier, really. I should have, but I didn't.
Who were some of the other people that influenced you?
Well, we heard Margaret Mead lecture when I was at the Maudsley. I heard quite a few people. I heard that man I quote, Glover. I heard Glover speak.
Anna Freud?
We heard Anna Freud. We had 3 lectures from Anna.
Mary Ainsworth?
A.S. Neil. I took my daughter Jenny to see A.S. Neil's school, Summerhill, and I said, remember this old man. You'll be able to say you met A.S. Neil.
Mm-hmm.
So I met a few people. Grantley Dick Reed, I went to his home, and he really started the natural childbirth movement. He's not remembered now as much as he should be.
And Mary Ainsworth also?
Mary Ainsworth, I spent a day with Mary Ainsworth, and I told her about how we reared our baby in a rubber boat, and she said, oh, that's interesting. She showed me the new test she'd got. She said, I'd like you to see our strange situation test. And so that was quite interesting. I went and saw that being done when they were just developing it. She and Mary Bleeha were doing it. And I went to see Connor in Harvard, and so on, Blurton Jones and Martin Smith I'd been to see. Is it Martin? Not Martin Smith, I can't remember. Anyway, we're out of time, are we?
Pretty close.
But, yeah.
Well, if you had one thing...
Most of them are dead. Ashley Montague, I had a day with Ashley Montague.
Ah.
I went to see him. And,
if there was one thing you could pass on for future generations, what would you say is the most... In closing, what would you like to say to future generations of all your accumulated experience and knowledge and wisdom? What is the most important thing to pass on?
Well, normal infancy involves a love affair that you can't rerun later. And the important thing to realise is that we are mammals and primates, and all mammals, by virtue of breastfeeding, have to keep the young near the mother. You can't breastfeed a child that you've lost. So going along with breastfeeding depends attachment. These two go together. You must have attachment between a breastfeeding animal and the mother, the infant and the mother. And that way she can protect and teach them. That's what mother does. But because humans have big heads, big brains, they can't stay in the uterus till they're as mature as, say, a baby chimpanzee or some of these other mammals that can walk from the time they're born. They have to come out very early. So in many ways, a human baby is an extra gestate. It's at a very early stage of development. And in that first year, a huge amount of brain develops. I think it just about trebles in size or something. And the corollary of that is that the mother, because she hasn't got hairy like a chimpanzee and the baby is so helpless, actually the baby can hold with the finger and thumb, but onto the hair, but therefore the mother, somebody has to carry that baby, so she needs support. And this defined the social circumstances in which humans who survived lived. They evolved, mothering took place with support in a group. And those facts about the baby determined the sort of social groups that survived. Now, there was an advantage in a father supporting the mother in that process. But the key thing was that the mother had support from other children. And babies are built to be attractive, they're built to want their own way, but they also have to be appealing to the group. They have to give rewards to their mother and they have to give rewards to the group. Otherwise, why bother? And this is what the child rearing and the mothering process needs to maximise these rewards. But you have to create the conditions in which this can happen. If you chop them all up and isolate them in high-rise flats, a mother and a baby, of course it's awful. And if you have a whole lot of mistaken beliefs at the same time, it must be hell. And of course that's why they want to jump out of it and hand it over to experts. But experts, you cannot pay people to love your baby. I think the Beatles said, money can't buy love, baby.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the story. That's what's wrong with early childcare. It's not the right way to treat a baby.
Very good. Well, I think that sums it up.
The story is interesting because there was, I told you over the phone, didn't I? And I found it quite hard to tell it without crying. So it shows that despite I had 4 cracks at psychotherapy, but the one that did me the most good was a sort of self-taught primal therapist where I had 3 weeks intensive. But the cockatiel only makes sense in the context of those separation experiences, you see. And I think it shows how unconscious motivation, I mean, I had a trauma, but I've sublimated it through doing something about it, because it wasn't so bad that I was crippled.
Mm-hmm.
But the cockatiel story was that my son-in-law caught this cockatiel because it was being ravaged by other birds. They were killing it, hounding it to death, and he put it in a cage. And I got upset about this because he used to sing, and I used to say he needs a mate, he needs company, he's unhappy. And he said, we might do it one day, but the kids liked it, and then I just sing. I said, I got more and more upset about this. And one day, in the shower, I heard this bird singing, and I said to myself, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And I burst into tears. And I thought, this isn't the bird that I'm upset about me. And how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land was a quote from one of the Psalms, I think, that they sang when they were in Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, by the waters of Babylon I sat down and wept when I remembered thee, O Zion. And this psalm on the opposite page had a picture of a canary in a cage, hanging in a window, looking out over a city with smoky chimneys. And this was where I had lived in Sheffield. Our city looked out over smoke and chimneys. And that picture, just that one, stuck in my mind. It's the only thing I can remember about that book. It's called Psalms in Everyday Life. And that stuck in my mind. And then all these years later, because that was pre-war, this thing suddenly comes into my head and makes me cry. And I thought, what's all this about, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it? And I thought, if I go back to that Japan, I think I was sensitised by the first separation. But the next one, where they cut off Japanese, Fukuba-san, my language, my home, my friends, everything gone, my father. And there I was, how could I sing the Lord's song?
And you were how old then?
2.5,
Mm-hmm.
see. And I cried when I think about it. And I think this illustrates in a neat capsule how unconscious factors operate, because it's a discrete story,
Mm-hmm.
and yet all sorts of people rave on in public. I think there's a huge amount of this. That psychiatric registrar, Tanvir Ahmed, I think his name is. Have you seen his articles?
No.
He's a Muslim, he's an ex-Muslim psychiatric registrar. And he said, what is it that unites all these people? You know, how come the left line up with the Muslims? What's going on with this sort of curious coalition? And he pointed out that all these people, Marx, Freud, Hitler, Stalin, they all had very deprived childhoods. And he thinks that there's a whole tradition of hurt and resentment and anti-authoritarianism that brings people together, and well, I all hate George Bush. They can all agree that we all hate Bush because he represents this oppressive father figure, you know. And I thought he's right. There's a whole lot of unconscious, for all it being 100 years since Freud wrote, you know, the psychopathology of everyday life. It goes on, influencing all sorts of things that happen in these mass movements. Are you filming all the time?
Mm-hmm.
There you go. See? So,
I missed that one.
How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? So I think that's part of what gives me the drive to see this, because I know it can be done. I know it could be better. And I know it's doable, you know.
Well, thank you again.